few weeks ago, I actually got to go see Nosferatu in a press screening, and it was really sweet. Got posters, a hat, got to learn about the film and the history of Vlad the Impaler before it showed, and it was all great until they started projecting it. And the issue was that Nosferatu isn't filmed in a traditional aspect ratio. It was filmed in a 1.66 to 1. They actually cut off the top and bottom of the film, and so for the first 5 minutes when Count Orlok is talking, you can't even see the subtitles, and kind of ruined the beginning of the film. But it also got me thinking, why do we use different aspect ratios? Why isn't there just a single one that everyone uses? And why did we move away from the traditional 4:3 aspect ratio to this wild west world of aspect ratios that we have today? And that's what led to me researching the history of the aspect ratio, and I found out it actually has a pretty interesting history ranging from murders to World War I and II technology being repurposed for film. And so I wanted to bring you along on a journey through the wild world of aspect ratios. From silent films in 1892 to modern day blockbusters.
7 years per hour here. Let's make it count.
Aspect ratios have played a key part in not only how a movie looks, but also in the emotions they make you feel and even where they're shown. There's a long history of innovation, competition, and of course, as with all things, repurposing technology that was originally made for war. So, let's dive into the unique history of film aspect ratios and the impact they've had on the world of cinema. First, let's get a quick definition of what an aspect ratio actually is. Basically, it's just the ratio between the width and the height of an image. It can be written like a ratio, like 4:3, or as a decimal, like 2.35. And these decimals can also be written as a ratio, like 2.35 to 1. Now, let's jump all the way back to the beginning. In 1892, William Dickson, an inventor working in Thomas Edison's lab, created one of the first movie cameras, the kinetograph. Whether or not it was the first movie camera is hard to say, but it's largely thought that Louis Le Prince, a French artist, actually created the first movie, but he mysteriously disappeared before he could patent it. And some people believe that Thomas Edison actually arranged for Le Prince's assassination to snuff out any of the competition, but that's a story for a different time. Dickson worked with Eastman Kodak to develop film for the device and landed on 35mm film with an exposure that was 4 perforations high. We don't know exactly why he decided on this height, but this created the 4:3 aspect ratio, and it would stand supreme for the next 40 years of filmmaking. But these early films were missing a key feature of what we know as film today: sound. Now, the films had live music to accompany them, but in 1927, when Warner Bros. Released The Jazz Singer, the world of cinema shifted.
Wait a minute, you ain't heard nothing yet. Wait a minute, I tell you, you ain't heard nothing.
The film used recordings made on wax records that played alongside the film and provided the actual sound of that actor talking, not just the music to accompany the film. This success cemented recorded sound in film, and in 1932, the Academy ratio was created. This ratio took the 4:3 ratio and condensed it to allow room for audio to be recorded alongside the film on the actual film strip. The image was then cropped to more closely resemble the 4:3 ratio, giving us the 1.37 Academy ratio, which stood atop the film world for the next 20 years until 1952. And it was used for the favorite movie of every film bro in your life, Citizen Kane.
Now, however, I have something more than a hope.
There are 2 main reasons that I found for why cinema moved to widescreen. The first is that directors felt like people didn't see the world in this cropped, boxy aspect ratio. The human eye saw a much wider field of view, and so they wanted to replicate that. The other, maybe more interesting one, is that Film studios were losing customers to the ever-growing popularity of film's little brother, television. And in order to pull people back to theaters, the studios needed something that television didn't have: the widescreen, immersive experience of Cinerama. Cinerama was developed by inventor Fred Waller and was based on his earlier Vitarama, a multi-projector system used primarily for, say it with me now, artillery training during World War II. It sported a whopping 2.59 aspect ratio, and it was monstrous compared to the earlier 1.37 Academy ratio. It was so large, in fact, that it required 3 carefully placed cameras to film the images and then 3 carefully placed projectors to project those images correctly on the 146-degree curved screen. This massive and immersive screen first showed the film titled This is Cinerama, which was received with roaring applause, but the film was more of an experience than a dramatic movie. And due to the difficult process of setting up 3 cameras and then 3 projectors, only a few dramatic films were actually made, with one of the most notable being in 1962 titled How the West Was Won. But around the same time that Cinerama was taking to the screens, another aspect ratio from 20th Century Fox was taking shape. And this one used anamorphic lenses. Anamorphic lenses were originally created to, say it with me now, see out of tanks in World War I. That's right, the original hypergonar lenses allowed soldiers in tanks to see a 180-degree image of what was outside. This was then later adapted for film and squeezed a 2x1 image onto the 4x3 film. The film was then projected back through a spherical lens that de-squeezed the image, giving it the final 2.35 aspect ratio, and was called CinemaScope. Now, originally CinemaScope had a 2.55 aspect ratio, but the addition of the magnetic and optical audio tracks reduced the image to 2.35. But the addition of sound was well worth it. This was a massive leap in the widescreen battles and allowed filmmakers to get a super wide image while only needing 1 camera. The first film shown in CinemaScope was The Robe, and it was a blockbuster hit. It stayed number 1 in the box office for 9 whole weeks, grossing $36 million in 1952. That's about $463 million in today's money when adjusted for inflation.
I wonder what $1 million even smells like.
Paramount Pictures saw the success of CinemaScope and knew they had to combat it in some way in order to draw in revenue. And in 1954, they debuted White Christmas in VistaVision.
What is Christmas with no snow?
Now, this originally had a 1.66 and then a 1.85 aspect ratio that was cropped during projection from a 1.5 ratio. VistaVision turned the standard 35mm film strip 90 degrees on its side to expose a larger image, and in doing so, had a much higher resolution image, reducing the visible grain. It also naturally had a widescreen aspect ratio that was so important to cinema. VistaVision meant that productions and cinemas didn't need the specialized equipment to work with anamorphic images and lenses. But in the 1960s, with advancements in film processing and advancements in the actual film stock, VistaVision fell out of popularity. The cameras were then sold off to international productions and showed up in classics like the Japanese film Death by Hanging in 1968 and In the Realm of the Senses in 1976. VistaVision then saw a resurgence in the 1970s, being used as a VFX format for films like the original Star Wars trilogy and the Back to the Future trilogy.
I saw part of the message.
I seem to have found it.
In the mid-50s, the Todd-AO format was introduced with the hit film Oklahoma in 1955. This introduced the 70mm format created by American producer Michael Todd and Dr. Brian O'Brien from the American Optical Company to the wider world. The film sported a 2.2 aspect ratio and had negatives that were twice the size of standard 35mm film. And this created a much more detailed image than what would have normally been seen on the standard 35mm format. With the introduction of Todd-AO, other production houses had to rush to create their own versions of that 70mm format, and this gave rise to the MGM 65 ratio that was then later refined into the Ultra Panavision format. It used an anamorphic D-squeeze of 1.25 with an aspect ratio of 2.76, and while MGM 65 wasn't used for many projects, it did produce one of the widest projected aspect ratios, a 2.94. That can be seen in the 1959 release of Ben-Hur. A recent use of the refined Ultra Panavision format can be seen in Hateful Eight. This gave the movie an old-timey Western feel while also emphasizing the cramped interior of the cabin that the whole film takes place in.
Hell, you must be frozen solid, poor thing.
Looks like Minnie's got her a full house.
Now, there were many other widescreen formats like Super Panavision 70 used for Lawrence of Arabia in 1962, and the Super Cinerama, which used the Ultra Panavision format but projected onto Cinerama screens, and that was used for 2001: A Space Odyssey in 1968.
Open the pod bay doors, Hal.
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
What's the problem?
I think you know what the problem is just as well as I do.
What are you talking about, Hal?
This mission is too important for me to allow you to jeopardize it.
I don't know what you're talking about, Hal.
I know that you and Frank were planning to disconnect me, and I'm afraid that's something I cannot allow to happen.
However, none of these had the larger-than-life feeling that IMAX created when it was introduced in 1970. Similar to how VistaVision turned 35mm film on its side, IMAX is the horizontal variant of 70mm film stock, and it was created by an, at the time, unknown company called Image Maximum, dubbing the whole format IMAX. With a massive 1.43:1 ratio on 70mm stock, the image is projected onto huge screens of 59 feet by 79 feet. The first film shown created with an IMAX camera was called Tiger Child, and it was an experimental short film directed by Canadian filmmaker Donald Bertain. This was shown at Expo 70 in Osaka, Japan, and with that success, the first IMAX theater was built in 1971 in Toronto at the Cinesphere Theatre. Now, today when you think of IMAX, many blockbusters might come to mind, like The Dark Knight or Terrence Malick's The Tree of Life. However, these films and many others like them were only partially filmed on IMAX.
Go!
Due to the issues and hardships of working with the format. But with the introduction of digital IMAX, more and more modern blockbusters are actually filming entirely in the format, like Dune Part 2 and Avatar: The Way of Water. IMAX has such a strange and interesting history that there could be an entire video just on this one format, so if that's something that you'd like to see, let me know in the comments below. Finally, we come to the year 1996.
Lots of hugging and kissing. It's a happy new year, 1996.
Engineers finally settled on 16:9 as a middle ground between the two most common extremes of the aspect ratio world, 4:3 and 2.35, thus cementing it as our modern HDTV aspect ratio. Now, quick side note, this was actually proposed by Dr. Kearns H. Powers of the SMPTE in 1984, so it was in the works for a pretty long time. HDTV could display both extremes with either a letterbox or a pillar box, and this allowed viewers at home to see the entire film regardless of the ratio that was used to make it. This format surged into the spotlight even more after the year 2000. When the computer industry adopted it as its main format, thus making it ubiquitous with online video, the format that you're watching this in. This ratio has dominated the online and broadcast space for many years, and it's actually even maintained the same ratio while increasing resolution into 4K UHD, and even as we push towards 8K. But there is a new ratio that is taking over, and it's unlike any that we've seen before it. 9:16. Pushed forward by social media and, most importantly, TikTok. This format has seen a wide range of content from memes and home videos to full-blown narrative series shot for it. The democratization of film and video has continued to allow more creators into the space, which has caused the formats to evolve faster and faster. Will we see 9:16 push the reigning champ of 16:9 to the wayside? I don't know. But remember, the ratio that you choose to film in, whatever one it may be, has a history to it. And that history will be in the subconscious mind of all those who watch it. This is why we see a lot of 4:3 now as a nostalgic format, because it harkens back to the original 4:3 format. If you enjoyed this style of video and made it all the way to the end here, let me know, because it's a new format for me, and if you like them, I'll keep making them. And as always, thanks for watching.